Right guys, today we're going to be doing a JZ Modular Harness. This is for a Link ECU and this is going into a vehicle with right-hand drive. So let's get into it. Right guys, as I said, this is a JZ Modular Harness. It is a completely brand new harness. This is built to be used in a right-hand drive vehicle, and it is a modular harness, and it's actually designed for use with either a Link X-Treme or a Link Storm ECU. So what we're going to be doing today, first of all, we're going to go through the entire build process of this particular harness. It's going to show you all the sub-harnesses that we have as well that go along with this particular setup. Then what we're going to do is we're going to go through the layout. So we're going to go through the entire harness, show you where everything goes, talk you through all of the modular harness, sub-harness sections that are there. And then what we'll do is we'll go through all of the extra plugs that are on the harness, as you can see over there. Once we've done that, then we're going to go into the actual testing of the harness. And again, that will be made up of just with the ignition on and obviously with the engine itself running. So, like I said, first thing we're going to do, let's go into the photos of the whole build process so you can see exactly what it takes to make one of these harnesses. So let's do that now. Right, so as I said, what we're going to do now is we're going to go through the layout of the harness. So that's going to be running from the ECU end all the way over to the engine, and then we're going to go through each and every single sub-harness that this thing is made of and go through the options that are available to you guys. Okay, so starting here with the ECU, it is really nice and simple. There's only two plugs. They are keyed. One's A, one's B, so you can't get them mixed up there. So that is really straightforward. Coming out of there, we then have the harness section that goes around there to the fuse box. This is included with the harness, and the section that comes from the harness also going into the fuse box over there. Okay, again, those two plugs are completely keyed and they're different, so you can't put the wrong one into the wrong place. And if you have a look over there, we have the customer plug there. That is what the customer is going to connect inside his vehicle over there. Moving along from there, we then have a bunch of harnesses coming over here. Some of these are what I call plugs where we pin everything that's not used out to it, and we're going to go through that. There's a whole page over here of all of those particular plugs. It does include a can, so you can see we've got the Haltech dash connected up to the can over there. We also have an accelerator pedal, which you can see over there. That is connected up over there, along with all the other ones that are not being used at the moment. They're obviously kept inside the vehicle to be kept out of the weather, so you don't have to worry about those. Moving along here now, you can see we've got our grommet over here with our piece of SCL heat shrink that we haven't actually shrunk down yet. Reason being is we like you guys to be able to move the grommet wherever you like in your particular setup, and that way then you can then seal it down once you're happy where the grommet is. So moving along there, we have our first breakout section over here. Now coming out of here, we have 4 sections all together. First one of those is going to be your map sensor. So that's designed to obviously go up against the firewall over there of your vehicle. And obviously you've got the nozzle there, which will be going into your inlet manifold, which will be running over here. Usually there's always front-facing intakes over there. Right, the next one, which is nice and small, is your wideband oxygen sensor. Now, in actual fact, what the wideband oxygen sensor is just a CAN plug, because again, we are using a CAN lambda setup in this particular engine. And obviously, you can also use some other CAN lambdas if you needed 2 lambda sensors. Obviously, you can use that and you can tag them all together. Okay, so this CAN bus and this CAN bus over here are exactly the same. So obviously, that CAN bus, if you're using a CAN lambda, is going to be limited to 1 megabits per second. You can't go down to 500. So if you wanted to connect an OBD2, we would then use this CAN port, the extra one that's underneath over here. So if you have a look, there's another CAN port over there. All right. Next up on here is your ignition, and you can see everything is labeled nicely for you guys. In this particular case, the customers opted for the Audi coils over there. So again, that plugs in directly over there. You can obviously unplug the entire harness with one plug, and you can pull all the coils out when it comes to service time if you want to do that. Last little section over there is going to be your injector sub harness. And again, everything is labeled for you guys, and it comes along here, breaks out into the first 3. So you can see it says injector 6 over there, and obviously injector 5 over there, and I don't have to go through the rest of it. Obviously, the customer's using these type of things, which is the USCAR or EV614, they're also known as. So those are the types of injectors that he is using. Okay. So that's that section over there. Some of you may notice we've moved it slightly further back because obviously these were getting really bunched up at the back here. So we gave some extra room here so that it didn't look so bad right here at the back. Okay. But moving along there, we have our next breakout point, which is right over here. And I'm just going to move this out of the way so we can see. Now, this is really nice and simple. There's literally only 3 sections that break out here. One is going to be your cam sensor. And in this case, we've got 2 earths. Obviously, some of the earths are coming from the ignition harness. We used to have a little ring terminal that pops out over there, but we've actually incorporated it into the main harness now so that you guys can bolt it directly to the inlet manifold. Usually, your guys' inlet manifolds are here, and obviously you can bolt that down there. If not, obviously it can bolt anywhere as long as it gets a good earth on the inlet manifold. That should be fine. Moving along to there, then we have our middle breakout section, which has got quite a lot of stuff going on. Now, obviously, you can see I've not got the inlet manifold on, so you can see everything and how it should look like. But yeah, so this would normally obviously be going down through here and making its way underneath here. So you're going to have things like your NOx sensors, coolant, etc., etc. Right, so breaking out of here, we're just going to go through it one by one. So the first one over here is gearbox. Now, in this particular case, the customer's not opted for a gearbox sub-harness, so that is just blanked off, as you can see, with a connector with just some seals in there. All right. Next up is going to be knock. Now, in this case, the customer has opted for Bosch wideband knock sensors. So we've got the kit for him there with the studs, with the nuts, with the sensors and the connectors and everything on there for him ready to go. So again, those are knock sensors. So they are going to be designed to basically replace the knock sensor there. You're going to pull that out, screw in the stud and then put the sensor down and put the nut in. And there's your other one over there. So again, really, really nice and straightforward. So that's your knock sensor there. In this case, we've got a fuel plug or fuel sub harness. And in this case, the customer has opted for a fuel pressure sensor. So again, you've made it about 30 centimeters long. So once it's down through there, you could actually bring it all the way up to here. If you've got if it's mounted to the firewall, your fuel pressure regulator, etc. Or if it's at the front, it's obviously will reach there as well. So it gives you a lot of opportunities to mount it in different places. And obviously, if it's a far off place that you need to have this extended, again, we can just unplug this and make this longer for you guys as well. But yeah, 30 centimeters is what we work with. It seems to work well for you guys. We don't have any sort of major issues there at all. Right, so that we've gone through knock, we've gone through fuel, and also what you'll notice in this case is the 4-pin plug, because we do have the ability to have both fuel pressure and temperature. But that is ECU dependent, guys. So do remember that the Link Storm doesn't have temp 4. So it's not going to be possible to use fuel temperature if you go with the Storm, only if you go with the X-Treme in this case. But we are going to go through that in a bit. We're going to go through the difference between the Storm and the X-Treme and what will work and what won't. Okay. Right, so that's the fuel one. And then we have the oil. So the oil has the ability to have both the oil pressure and temperature in. In this case, the customer has opted for a Bosch combined pressure and temperature sensor. So he's going to be able to monitor that. So again, it's a little short harness. It's kind of designed to take the place of your original oil pressure switch that you have over there. So that should be really straightforward to go in there. Remember, everything's going to be popping down through the actual inlet manifold there on that side. Okay, so that is, again, so we've got fuel, we've done oil, we've done knock. And then I think the next one is going to be throttle. So as you would have noticed, the customer's opted for a Bosch 74mm throttle body. And we've supplied him with a Bosch fast response intake air temperature sensor. And that forms the throttle harness. It's those two sections over there. Obviously, his throttle would be here. And the harness for the intake temperature is designed to go into the intake pipe, which is coming directly up to the throttle over there. So that's why they are close together. Right, so there is one little harness section that is popping down over here, or not, it's actually popping down just through over there. So again, nice little thin wire there, and that is going to be your starter motor plug. So again, you see labeled as STA for starter, and that's going to go into your starter motor over there. Okay. Right, so that's pretty much everything that's coming out at this particular junction. Obviously, it is quite hefty, but it does sort of tuck away down underneath there, so you don't really see all of this as it goes through there. Now, I'm just going to move some of this out of the way so we can make our way around to the other section of the harness there. Let me just pop that out of the way. Right, okay, so the harness here will just carry on. So that's the harness I'm holding over here, pop around over there, and then it comes and it does another breakout over here, which then breaks out and goes to your VVT-i oil control valve. It also breaks out and goes to your coolant temp sensor. Now, in this particular case, the customer is using a 2JZ GE VVT-i that is built up and is turbocharging as well. So in this case, his coolant temperature sensor is going to be here because it's a 2JZ GE VVT-i originally. All right. So what we've done is obviously we've broken this out over here so that if it is a GTE version and you have your coolant temperature sensors here, well, obviously that'll just flap over and go to here and plug in over here and make its way down to the coolant. If you guys are using a 2JZ GE VVT-i exactly like this setup, then obviously it's long enough to pop down through over here underneath there and then plug into the coolant temperature sensor over there. Okay. It is a 3-pin plug because we do have the ability to add a sensor to go if you guys didn't have, like in this particular case, he's using a Haltech dash, but if you wanted to have a separate coolant temperature sensor, what we can do is we can actually take another wire into here, which comes out at the fuse box over there, which I'll go through in a minute. And as you can see here, we've actually fitted a JZ 100 temperature sensor. You guys normally have a brass blank in there, so you can fit a JZ 100 sensor, and we can actually make a sub harness with both this temperature sensor and that one. And vice versa, if it was per se a JZ 100, you would have already had the two sensors here at the front. You had the 2-wire one and the single wire one for the gauge. Okay, so we're just accommodating every sort of eventuality that you guys might have. All right, moving further along there, the harness is going to come down here and it's going to break out over here. Okay, and it's going to break out to go to your crank sensor. So again, all nicely labeled over there. It's going to break out to go to your alternator. In this case, the customer is using a Bosch alternator. So again, that is his specific connector over there. When I'll be testing, I'll be using the standard Toyota alternator. So I've got that one, which plugs in directly over there. And then lastly over here, we've got the Mac boost valve. So that comes along and goes over there. So you can fit it in the corner here, right where your turbocharger is going to be. All right. So that's basically the whole setup of the harness, the complete layout. So what we're going to do now, we're going to pop over to those sheets over there and let's start explaining some of the things that are going on here. All right, so let's focus on these plugs for now because these are the auxiliary ones over here. So as I get, like everything else, you can see that is labeled as CAN. That is going off to our Haltech. Remember guys, Haltech and Link have a different pinout for CAN high, CAN low. So obviously what I've done is I've changed the plug on here to fit into our harness. Nice extension over there so he can run the dash from there because again, all of the ECU and the fuse box and everything is going to be on the other side of the vehicle. And so that should be long enough to run all the way across to the dash over there. So that should be fine. So next up we have analog or ANA that I've labeled up there, 6-pin connector. And if you come along here, you'll see we've got analog over there. So basically it's analog voltage 8, 9, 10, and 11. We've also provided a 5 volts and a sensor ground because obviously you need that to be able to use the analog voltage inputs. What you'll also notice here is I have stated that analog voltage 9, 10, and 11 is for extreme only. So if you have a storm, you'll only be able to utilize analog voltage 8, not 9, 10, and 11. Okay. Now then, the next one I want to find is the auxiliary plug. So let's pop over here. There you go. There she is, auxiliary. Again, another 6-pin DTM plug, but they are all labeled for you there. Auxiliary, you got auxiliary 8, which is an unused auxiliary output. We've also got injector 7, injector 8, and ignition 7 and ignition 8. So these, again, are unused outputs that you guys can use if you so desire. Then I'm going to pop over here and find the 4-pin plug that is going to be our digital. So again, there you go. See labeled DIG for digital. Nice little 4-pin DTM plug there. And that's just going to have digital 5, 6, 7, and 8. Okay. So again, nice and simple. It's just that if you guys want to use them, they are available. You don't have to worry about adding anything into here. There's pretty much nothing on here that's not connected to something over there that you can interface with. All right. Next up is going to be your pedal. So there's your pedal harness over there. In this case, obviously, we're supplying it to the customer, so it's all ready to go into his vehicle and work. But in this case, you'll see that we've got pin 1 is sensor 1, pin 2 is sensor 2, 3 is 5 volts, and pin 4 is sensor ground. Okay, so that is absolutely fine. No worries there. And then lastly, like I said, we've got the CAN plug over there. But again, nice and simple, nothing to worry about. Just it's 12 volts, it's ground, and it's CAN low, and it's CAN high. Okay, and that is obviously the link CAN wiring that we've put it onto. So in this case, if you use a Haltech, you've got to change the CAN high and low wires around. Luckily, the 12 volts and grounds are the same. It's there. So in this particular harness over here, in terms of the dash, it is actually being powered from this plug. Both the power and the ground are being supplied from the harness for that. So he doesn't have to actually worry about anything. He could literally just mount the dash, plug in that plug, and everything will work, as you'll see when we come to do the testing. Right, so moving on now to the 9-pin plug that you see over there. Now that is very standardized plug in this particular case. If you've seen any of our other videos, you'll know exactly how that is going to work. So I'm going to go through all 9 pins there for you, which are over here, and I'll go through explaining some details of exactly how they're connected. So red is permanent 12 volt supply. Now in this case, it doesn't need to be permanent 12 volt supply because obviously the aftermarket ECUs do not require a permanent 12 volt supply. So if you want to put that through an ignition switch or whatever that is capable of obviously powering everything in the harness. Again, it is a 14 gauge wire. So if you are going to put it through some kind of ignition switch, make sure that it's capable of doing everything, including supplying enough power to turn over the starter motor and the coils, etc., etc. Next up is going to be number 2, which is going to be our black with a yellow one. Now that is the start signal. Now again, as with all our link ECUs and aftermarket ones where we can, the ECU itself is controlling the starter motor. So that black wire with a yellow tracer, that is a signal to the ECU to tell it to turn the starter motor over. All right, so that means that that wire can either get a 12 volts or a ground, depending on which one you opt for. You do need to make the changes inside the ECU. We always set it up to accept a 12 volts because that is the most common signal that you guys are going to have. But again, if you don't want to have numerous 12 volts floating around your vehicle, you are more than happy to obviously change that to a ground as well. No problems there at all. Next up is going to be number 3, which is yellow with a green. Now then, in this particular case, the yellow with the green is not actually connected to anything because that is for a gauge for water temperature, okay? So as I explained to you here, this is why this is a 3-pin plug when clearly we're only using 2 pins. Now in this case, because the customer is using the Haltech dash, obviously there is not necessary to use the 3rd wire for a coolant temperature sensor for a separate gauge inside the vehicle, okay? But if he ever wanted to change his mind, he could phone us up. We could supply him with that over there, with the extra wire for the temperature gauge, and then the yellow with the green wire, that is where the signal would come out. So it takes all the work out of it. You could just use that to then run to a separate gauge, okay? So right, that is the yellow. Green number 4 is going to be gray. So you can see it over there, and that is your fuel pump. So as per usual, the ECU in this case is controlling the fuel pump. So that is relatively straightforward. Obviously, it'll prime how you set it up, and obviously it's just a simple on-off system with a relay over there. It is fused up to I think 20 amps because it's running a 16 gauge wire, so that is more than enough. But if you require more pumps that are going to take a bit more power, then by all means, please feel free to use that gray wire to trigger relays by the tank to provide more power to power your fuel pumps, okay? So it's not the end of the world. You can use that, but also remember that you do have these auxiliary outputs available. So if you wanted to run these down to trigger some relays, if you wanted to have 2 fuel pumps, etc., all doable. Again, just give us a shout. Tell us how long you need it to be, what you want the connection on the other end to be, and we can make you a harness that'll plug directly into your existing sections over there. Okay. Next up is number 5. That's going to be yellow with a red tracer, and that is going to be check engine light. So again, in this particular case, obviously the customer is not going to be using that because he does have the Haltech dash. So we're communicating via CAN, and we can send all the information we need to that dash. But what we do is we do still put the LED inside the fuse box there. So when you switch the ECU on or the ignition on, obviously that will then come alive, and you can still use that as a traditional check engine light. And the yellow with the red wire, obviously that is then connected to that, so you can use that if you wanted to. All right. Next up, number 6 is going to be yellow, which is going to be your tacho signal. Again, that is being output via the ECU, but I don't have to say it again. With the Haltech dash, that is no longer necessary because you're communicating engine speed via CAN with that one. But if he does want to use a separate one, or he sells the harness onto somebody else and they don't have the dash, obviously they can then use that yellow wire for a tacho signal. Next up is number 7, and that's going to be black with a red tracer, and that is your ignition power. So that's the one that's going to turn on the system, okay? That's just triggering a couple of relays. Also, it goes to the ECU to tell the ECU that the ignition switch is connected as well, if you need to use that for anything in particular, but that is there and available for you guys as well. Again, that does require a 12-volt signal that you can't run off the ground, so you do need to provide a 12 volts for that one. And one quick note, if you are using a key barrel, please just make sure that you get the ignition feed and not the accessory feed. The accessory feed is basically the one that cuts out when you move the key from the on to the start position. Now, obviously, if you're going to use the key barrel to do both the start and the ignition, that's going to be super important, because if you move the key to start, it's going to shut the whole system down while you're trying to crank it. And then obviously the engine's not even going to crank in this case, because you're actually going to shut the ECU down, and therefore it's not going to be able to activate the starter relay. Okay. So again, if you're not sure, find the 12 volts behind your ignition barrel, but then move the key to the start position and make sure the 12 volts stays and doesn't go away. If it goes away, that's your accessory feed. That's not your ignition feed. Go and then find the ignition feed from there. Okay. Right, so that's ignition. And then we've got number 8, which is going to be your pink with the blue, and that is going to be your charge light. So in this case, with the Bosch alternator, that's actually the only thing that's connected in this particular case. Obviously, we've connected all the other 2 wires that would be used if you had a Toyota alternator. So again, if the customer ever wants to sell the harness on, somebody could use their standard Toyota alternator. They would just have to give us a call and we could make them an alternator sub harness. If you are going to be using that, guys, for a light, also do bear in mind that we have seen in the past with very old clusters where they're using actual bulbs and not LEDs, that those clusters can backfeed into the alternator. And remember that there is an ignition supply to the alternator. So please make sure, if you are using an old dash, 2 options. 1, either fit a diode so that a dash can't backfeed in, or switch the bulb out for an LED, which will do exactly the same job, because the LED is a light emitting diode. So that solves your problem right there. All right, and the last one is going to be yellow with a black oil pressure. Now then, obviously in this particular case, the customer has opted for a Bosch combined pressure and temperature sensor. Now, what we have then done is we have actually scrapped the oil pressure switch, which is over there. But the way the harness does work, on the oil side, we have a 6-pin plug for that exact reason. We still can fit the oil pressure switch if you guys wanted. So if he wanted to sell the harness on and wanted to keep his sensor, he could do that. And the next person who buys it could obviously just phone us up and we can make them a harness that basically just goes to the oil pressure switch. That oil pressure switch does also feed to the ECU. So if you are using just the switch, you can still at least shut the engine down if you lost oil pressure. So don't worry about that too much. And also then you would use the yellow with the black one to activate an oil pressure light for your dash. Again, in this case, the customer is going to be able to customize that dash, and the ECU can output a signal for oil pressure, and he can customize that because he's actually measuring the pressure and not just relying on a switch that's going to activate only when the pressure is extremely low. Okay. Next up is the 6-pin plug. Now, this plug only actually comes with the harness if you opt for the gearbox sub harness. So in this case, the customer has not opted for the gearbox sub harness. So if the customer did want to change his mind later on and add it on, we could supply him with that. If his gearbox is capable of having a reverse switch, obviously we can make that for him. And then obviously the orange wire that would come in that one, that is your reverse lights. That'll give 12 volts when it's in reverse. And the white blue pin number 2 is your speed signal. So again, if your gearbox is capable of having a speed sensor of some description fitted onto it, again, that can all be wired to this gearbox plug. We've got obviously a 12 volts and everything to go inside there to activate a Hall effect style sensor, and then that speed signal would come out on the second plug. Okay, so again, we only supply those if you have the gearbox, because obviously if you don't have the gearbox harness, literally nothing of those 6-pin plugs are going to work at all. So it would be completely useless to you to have that. All right. Now then, moving on to the very last bit that I want to cover, and that is obviously, as I said, this is designed to work both with the Link X-Treme and a Storm. Okay, so I've got the 2 pinouts here which come with the welcome pack, and as you can see, there are certain things with the Storm that are not connected. Like I said, voltage, analog voltage 10 and 11, you can see there. Number 26, which is auxiliary 10, because that's drive-by-wire. 24 is analog voltage 9. 18 is auxiliary 9 because of the drive-by-wire, and then you have temp 4 that is not connected, and then number 5 is usually the 12-volt input for the drive-by-wire. Okay, so the reason we have the throttle plug here is obviously if you went for a Storm, you obviously couldn't use the drive-by-wire like this, but you could use a cable-operated throttle, and the TPS signals are inside there for you guys, so there's no need to worry with that at all. It's all there. You can use either or. And also, if you bought the harness and started out with a Storm because your budget dictated that, and later on, like a year later on, if you wanted to upgrade, by all means, you can sell your Storm, buy an X-Treme, plug it straight in, phone us up, we'll make you a harness for a drive-by-wire throttle. Everything is fine. You don't need to replace the harness. You can just replace the certain elements that are required to upgrade. Okay. Right, so that is the entire layout and a good explanation of obviously all the bits and bobs and the differences between the different setups that you can work with. Obviously, we're trying to make harnesses that work with more than one setup, and luckily with these ECU manufacturers, they do give us the ability to do that because they make it possible by having the Storm and the X-Treme almost identical with just a few little sections missing out there. Okay, but yeah, so what we're going to do now is I'm going to get everything done and ready so that we can carry on with the testing. Now, I will say, obviously, I do test all of the injectors and the coils and everything like that, but I'm not going to subject you to that half an hour of boring episode. So there are only a few tests that we are going to be carrying out. Mostly, obviously, going to be turning it on, etc. But I'll be back in a minute with the whole test sheet, and we will start that procedure. Right, guys, so we're back for the testing part of the video, and as I said, there's going to be 2 sections, one with the ignition on and one with the engine actually running. Just a heads up, obviously with the engine running, it's going to change dramatically from what you see here. I'm doing the testing with the ignition on with all of the sensors and actuators that are going to be going with this harness. Obviously with it running, I'm going to put the original 2JZ GE manifold on with the original coils, plug the original injectors in, and we're going to get it up and running, so making sure that everything like the cam and crank sensors and everything are working as we expect them to. All right. In terms of testing, I'm not doing an extensive test. I do have a nice video on my link playlist that'll show you exactly how to test all your inputs and outputs. Obviously, all the coils and injectors, we do physically test them one by one through the ECU. Again, if you watch that video, it'll explain to you exactly how to do that. And I do advise people to do that when you're fitting it for the first time, just to make sure that everything is correct. So assume nothing in that particular case. So what are we going to be testing today? It's a small broken down section. So first of all, we're going to be looking for the check engine lights. So what I want to do is I want to see the LED pop up and light up over there. The oil pressure switch and the alternator light are not applicable because you're using the dash. So obviously it's going to show battery voltage on there. And obviously because he's using an oil pressure sensor and not the switch, he's actually going to have oil pressure on his dash, which he can then put warnings for on the dash there. Then we're going to go over and we are going to test the oil pressure. We are going to test the oil temperature. So I'm basically going to unplug the oil pressure and temperature sensor, and you'll see it go from a reading to no reading. Fuel pressure, exactly the same, but all I'm going to basically do is I'm going to blow into the sensors just so I can get a reading on the dash, and we're going to be able to see it on the Haltech dash over there as well as the actual Link software. Fuel temperature, obviously not applicable in this case. Coolant temp, exactly the same as the other ones. I'm going to disconnect the coolant temperature. You see it's going to go from a value to 100 and then down to a value again. And drive-by-wire, I'm simply just going to press the pedal with the ignition on, and you're going to see the actual throttle blade moving open and closed as I do that. So that's the one with the ignition on, and then we're going to come back later and we're going to do the one with the engine running. And again, nice little short test. It's going to be the starter circuit, so we're going to make sure that the ECU is set up correctly, that if you supply 12 volts to the black with a yellow wire, that the ECU will take over and start the engine. We're then going to look at the tacho, so we want to make sure, because in this case he's using a Haltech dash, we want to make sure that the RPM is displaying on there. and working correctly. And obviously, because we're running the engine, we want to make sure that the coolant temperature is actually rising as we run the engine. So that's nice and straightforward. Again, there's things like setting base timing, etc., but they are all in my link playlist video. So I do recommend you go and watch it. It's very useful if you guys want to set up link ECUs and so on and so forth. All right, so moving on to testing with the ignition on, and that requires me to put the ignition on. So bear with me a second while I quickly supply the black with the red wire with 12 volts. Bear with me. Okay. Right, so you can actually hopefully hear in the background there that the fuel pump is working because I have set it to prime for 3 seconds after the ignition goes on. So that's great. We can also see the Haltech dash is working. We can see coolant temp, air temp, oil pressure, fuel pressure, battery voltage, and obviously throttle position and manifold pressure as well. Okay, so moving on to the testing, we're starting off with the check engine light. So we can see our check engine light is turning on there. So that's absolutely fine. Then we're going to move over to the oil pressure. So what I'm going to do basically is, as I said, I'm just going to blow into this gently just so you can actually see the values go up and down. So there's the oil pressure over there. There you go. Again, so I've just blown into that just so I can get a reading for that as well. And moving on to the next one, which is the oil temperature. Now, in this case, I've not displayed the oil temperature on the Haltech dash, but I have displayed the temperature over there. So you can see oil temperature is 19.9, 19.8 degrees, fluctuating ever so slightly. So again, all I'm going to literally do is just disconnect the sensor. Sorry if the camera shakes a little bit as I do that. Okay, so I've got the sensor in my hand, and you can see now that the oil pressure and oil temperature have gone to 0. And I will plug it back in again. Okay. And obviously you can see we are back again with an oil temperature reading over there. Right, so moving on to the next thing, which I think was fuel pressure, if I'm not mistaken. Let's have a look over there. Yeah, fuel pressure. So again, just going to blow into the sensor here quickly just so I can get a reading on there. And as you can see, I've got fuel pressure in the top right corner over there. There you go. Fantastic. Okay, so you can see that is going up and down, and it is transmitting via CAN from the ECU to the dash. Coolant temperature, nice and simple. You can see we've got coolant temperature is at 15 degrees right now. So what I'm going to do is I'm basically going to unplug the coolant temperature. And as I do, you're going to see it's going to shoot up to, I think, a value of 100 degrees. There you go. Plug it back in again. It goes back down to 15. Okay. I'll also do the intake air temperature while I'm here. So again, you can see I've got the intake air temperature sensor there. You can see we've got air temp in the corner there at 18 degrees. And if I unplug it, it goes to 100. And if I plug it back in again, which is deceptively difficult single-handedly, and that goes back to 17, 18 degrees over there. So that's fantastic. So we're super happy with the coolant temp and the intake air temp. Next up is the drive-by-wire. So again, I'm just going to press the pedal over here, and you can see the actual throttle moving open and closed there. Okay. So that's fantastic as well. Obviously, you'll see the check engine light started to flash because I disconnected the oil pressure. So obviously it's got an error code now on that one. So you can flash the error code through the check engine light if you want as well. But obviously you can just plug your laptop in and read all the codes from there. Right, so that's pretty much it for the testing that we're going to do. As I will iterate again, I have a load of link videos, an entire playlist that goes through a whole load of procedures from setting inputs and outputs to testing inputs and outputs, etc. So again, I'm not going to make 2-hour long videos going through all the testing, but yeah, watch that video. It'll show you exactly how to do it. And obviously we do all that testing in the background here. So next step is for me to return this engine to a stage where we can obviously get it running. So let me do that now, and we'll be back in a minute and we'll do the test with it running. Right guys, so we're back now for the testing with the engine actually running. So as you can see here, I have put the original inlet manifold back onto the engine so we can get it running. I've obviously put all of the original coils back on, and we've got our little sort of jumper harness so we can still use the igniter, because obviously the link cannot fire these dumb coils on its own. Okay. You'll also notice that I haven't actually plugged into the pedal position sensor on this one over here. We are still actually using a drive-by-wire pedal. So again, that is completely fine, usable if you guys want. So again, even if you guys are using this harness on a standard engine with a standard throttle body, you can actually use an electronic drive-by-wire pedal. You are not restricted to using this particular one over here. So you can get rid of the cable in the engine bay if you so desire. Okay, so getting back to it, the starting test is going to be super simple. Basically, all we're looking for is I'm going to touch the black with the yellow tracer wire to 12 volts. ECU is going to kick in, it's going to take over, it's going to start the engine, and obviously she's going to run. Once she's running, we're going to be looking for the tacho signal, so that's going to be on the dash over here. Down in the bottom over there, we'll see the engine RPM over there. And then obviously looking at the coolant temp, I wanted to see it go up, and you can see we are on about 87 degrees because obviously I've had it up and running just to make sure that everything is working as expected. Okay, so to get into it, so it's nice and simple and short and sweet. I'm going to take the black with the yellow tracer wire, and I'm just going to touch it to 12 volts, and I'm going to do that now. So there you go, the ECU took over there and it started up the engine, no problem at all. So she's idling nicely now. We can pop over here and we can see we've got our engine RPM signal over there. So that is fantastic and working exactly as we expect it to. I'm going to give her a little bit of a rev over there. And you can see that engine RPM and needle are working exactly as we expected to. Okay, right, so I'm going to just quickly pull this out. And there you go. Okay, right, so that's everything cool. She's working exactly as we expected to. Obviously, I've made all the changes in the ECU for the different setup to get it running. I will put that all back for the customer, so when he gets it, it's all okay. Just remember, guys, when you are buying harnesses like these, especially when you're putting aftermarket injectors and so on and so forth, you want to try and get all of the data from the injectors. We set all these ECUs up with our sort of, so to speak, base maps, and we set all your inputs and outputs out if we build your harness for you. So that is already done and ready to go. But obviously things like injector data we don't have because we don't usually have the injectors here. So just make sure when you are setting it up that you do put all the injector data in, etc. If we've had the coils, like in this case, we've actually had those Audi coils, I have set all the dwell times and everything for the Audi coils. So that is all set up for the customer, but obviously inject data is not. And as I said before, I would still advise everybody to do the normal procedure, and that is going to be to obviously check your base timing. So again, you've got all your marks down here on your pulley over there. These are 0, 5, 10, and 15 degrees. Obviously, in the case of my timing light, I can just put it around the actual harness for the cylinder 1 coil, and I can get that to work, so that's fantastic. If not, you can then pull that out and put a spark plug lead between the coil and cylinder 1 and take it from there. Now, obviously, I've done a video on how to check the base timing, so again, if you refer back to the link playlist, it'll all be in there for you guys. And like I said, with a whole bunch of other stuff. But yeah, if you guys have any questions about a harness like this, if you want quotes, etc., please give us a shout. Obviously, we'll need to have a full breakdown of all the sub harnesses, and we'll need to know exactly what you are running with your harness to obviously make sure that everything is correct with that. But yeah, you can give us a shout at Phoenix Engine Management on Facebook. If you have any questions about the harness or setting up a link ECU, you can also comment down below. But hopefully that playlist will answer a lot of your guys' questions in relation to setting up and doing a first start on a link ECU. But thanks for watching, guys. Let's get this all packaged up for the customer and get it off so that he can start enjoying his engine. Thanks for watching, guys. We'll see you again later. Bye-bye.
Break, always fight, never quit, do it right, play the game, win it life, have no shame, there's no time, feel the pain, live the grind, I could change, in my mind, pick a lane, commit and climb, the only way to win it life. I never miss, that's fact, taking big swings, put your hand to the bat, put me in the ring, you'll go out in a bag, cause I sing what I mean and I bring it to the mad light. Ain't got time to kill, I got time to feel, I took the red pill, I know life's short so I wanna live real, but how's it supposed to feel?